On Washington Journal this morning, a discussion of the president's plan for the Guantanamo Bay detention facility with Devin Chafee from the group Human Rights First and Cully Stimson, the former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs. Democratic Representative Sheila Jackson Lee will take your questions about the budget for the Transportation Security Administration. And we'll talk with Bing West, former Assistant Defense Secretary in the Reagan administration. He recently returned from Afghanistan after meeting with U.S. and Afghan military officials. Washington Journal is live on C-SPAN every day at 7 a.m. Eastern. The House Energy and Commerce Committee this morning continues to mark up a bill designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Live coverage is on C-SPAN 3 at 10 a.m. Eastern.
Is there anything that you regret writing?
What is your opinion on same-sex marriage?
Do you tend to have certain biases to certain political parties?
Next week on C-SPAN, Students and Leaders, as Washington, D.C. high school students question leaders in politics, media, and government. Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern, Washington Post politics and internet reporter Jose Antonio Vargas with students at Cardozo Senior High School. Then at 7 p.m. Eastern, Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele meets with Woodson Senior High School students. 2 one-hour programs each weekday beginning Monday at 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern. C-SPAN, bringing students and leaders together like no other network.
The Senate has rejected President Obama's request for $80 million to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The vote, 90-6, as senators from both parties said they wanted more information about the president's plan. This portion of the debate is about 2 hours.
Let me just say to my good friend, the Majority Leader, I concur with his observations about how the Senate should appropriately work. I think we've had a process for handling legislation this year that both sides can be proud of. And I want to say that I concur entirely with his observations about the way the Senate is working. Obviously, the minority doesn't agree with a lot of the things that we're doing, but the opportunity to shape legislation and for each senator to make a difference has been respected this year, and for that I commend the Majority Leader. Mr. President, there now appears to be a wide bipartisan agreement in the Senate that closing Guantanamo before the administration has a plan to deal with the detainees there was a bad idea. Senators will make it official today with their votes. For months, we've been saying what Senate Democrats now acknowledge, that because the administration has no plan for what to do with the 240 detainees at Guantanamo, it would be irresponsible and dangerous for the Senate to appropriate the money to close it. So I commend Senate Democrats for fulfilling their oversight responsibilities by refusing to vote to provide any funding to close Guantanamo until the administration can prove to the American people that closing Guantanamo will not make us less safe than Guantanamo has. Those of us in Congress have a responsibility to American servicemen and women risking their lives abroad and to citizens here at home. Congress will demonstrate its seriousness about that responsibility when it votes against an open-ended plan to release or transfer detainees at Guantanamo. The administration has shown a good deal of flexibility on matters of national security over the past few months. On Iraq, for example, in not insisting on an arbitrary deadline for withdrawal. On military commissions, by deciding to resume their use. On prisoner photos, by concluding that releasing them would jeopardize the safety of our servicemen and servicewomen. And on Afghanistan, by replicating the surge strategy that worked so well in Iraq. I hope the administration will show more of this flexibility by changing its position on an arbitrary deadline for closing Guantanamo. Americans don't want some of the most dangerous men alive coming here or released overseas, where they can return to the fight, as many other detainees who've been released from Guantanamo already have. Now, some will argue that terrorists can be housed safely in the U.S. based on past experience. But we've already seen the disruption that just one terrorist caused in Alexandria, Virginia. And the number of detainees the administration now wants to transfer stateside is an order of magnitude greater than anything we've considered before. It's one thing to transfer one or two terrorists, disruptive as that may be. It's quite another to transfer 50 to 100 or more, as Secretary Gates has said would be involved in any transfer from Guantanamo. In my view, these men are exactly where they belong, locked up in safe and secure prison, and isolated many miles away from the American people. Guantanamo is a secure, state-of-the-art facility. It's got courtrooms for military commissions. Everyone who visits is impressed with it. Even the administration acknowledges that Guantanamo is humane and well run. Americans want these men kept out of their backyards and off the battlefield. Guantanamo guarantees it. The administration has said that the safety of the American people is its top priority. I have no doubt that this is true, and that's precisely why the administration should rethink its plan to close Guantanamo by a date certain. It should have focused on a plan for these terrorists first. Once the administration has a plan, we'll consider closing Guantanamo, but not a second sooner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Number one, I would like to associate myself with the comments of the minority leader about Guantanamo Bay. It is a location that does protect our national interest in terms of a location. It is probably the best run military prison in the world. I've been there several times. And to the Guard force and those who are serving at Guantanamo Bay, in many ways you're the unsung heroes in this war because it's tough duty. You have to go through a lot to be a member of the Guantanamo Bay Guard team, and they do a wonderful job. It is a very Geneva Convention compliant jail, and there's some pretty bad characters down there who make life miserable for our Guard force. But those who serve at Guantanamo Bay do so with dignity and professionalism, and their motto, I believe, is honor bound, and that certainly reflects upon them well. Now, the idea of the Congress saying we want a plan before we appropriate money to close Guantanamo Bay makes a lot of sense to me. You see a bipartisan movement here to make sure that we know what we're going to do with the detainees that are housed at Guantanamo. The American people should be rightly concerned about how we dispose of these prisoners. Quite frankly, they're not common criminals accused of robbing a liquor store. They're accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda or allied groups who have taken up arms against the United States, and their mission and their purpose is to destroy our way of life and to put our allies and friends in the Mideast into the Dark Ages. So if you do not want to go back to the Dark Ages in terms of humanity, if you want young girls to grow up without having acid thrown in their face, if you want a young woman to be able to have a say about the future of her children in the Mideast, then we need to come up with a rational policy regarding fighting Al-Qaeda, and once we catch them, how to dispose of their cases and make sure that they're not only fairly treated, but their mission and their goals are defeated and they do not return to the fight. We have seen in Iraq that there are Muslim populations that do not want to be part of the Al-Qaeda agenda. Al-Qaeda followed us to Iraq because they understood if we were successful there, creating a democracy in the heart of the Mideast, it would be a threat to their agenda. Iraq has a ways to go, but I'm very proud of the Iraqi people. They have come together. They're making political reconciliations. Their army and police force is getting stronger. And the story of the surge is that the Iraqi people joined with our forces and coalition forces and delivered a mighty blow against Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was, quite frankly, is in the process of being defeated by the Iraqi people with our help. Now the fight goes to Pakistan and Afghanistan. I cannot think of a more noble cause than to take up arms and fight back against these terrorists who wish the world ill, who will do anything in the name of their religion to have their way, who would make life miserable for parts of this world and eventually make life miserable for us. Just imagine a caliphate being established in Baghdad, which was their plan, to put the Mideast in constant turmoil. You would not be able to travel freely in this world. You couldn't interact or do business with the people in that part of the Mideast. It's a very oil-rich region. So it is in our national security interest to stand with moderate people in the Mideast and other places where Al-Qaeda attempts to take over and fight back. But when we fight back, we don't have to be like them. Quite frankly, if we are like them when we fight back, we'll lose. This is an ideological struggle. There is no capital to conquer. There is no Navy to sink or Air Force to shoot down. We cannot kill enough of the terrorists to win the war. What we have to do is contain them, fight them, and empower those who live in the region who want to live a different way, give them the capacity to defend themselves and to bring about a stable life within their countries. That's what we're trying to do in Iraq. And if we win in Iraq, you'll have a democracy in the heart of the Arab world that will be an ally to this country in perpetuity. You'll have replaced a dictator named Saddam Hussein, and you'll have a place where you can show the world that there are Muslims who do not want to be governed by the Al-Qaeda agenda. And to me, that is a major win in the war on terror. Now we're in Afghanistan. We've lost ground, but we're about to recapture that ground of the Taliban, which are Al-Qaeda sympathizers and who, quite frankly, allowed them to operate in Afghanistan late in the last century, early in this century, to plan the attacks of 9/11. So that's why we're fighting. That's why we're in this discussion. That's why we're concerned about releasing these prisoners within the United States, and that's why we're concerned about Guantanamo Bay. We have every right and reason to be concerned as to how we move forward. Now, I want to move forward. We need a plan to move forward, and we should not close Guantanamo Bay until we'll have a comprehensive, detailed legal strategy as to what we will do with these prisoners. Where we put them is only possible if people know what we will do with them. So you have to explain to the American people and our allies the disposition plan. What are we going to do with these detainees? Then where you put them becomes possible. Without what to do, you're never going to find where to put them. I do believe that the President and our military commanders are right when they say it's time to start over. It is a shame that we're having to start over because Guantanamo Bay is a well-run jail. But as I mentioned before, this ideological struggle that we're engaged in, the enemy has seized upon the abuses at Abu Ghraib, the mistakes at Guantanamo Bay, and they use that to our detriment. They inflame populations in the Mideast based on our past mistakes. And our commanders have told me to a person that if we could start over with detention policy and show the world that we have a new way of doing business, a better way of doing business, it would improve the ability of our troops to operate in the regions in question where the conflict exists. It would undercut the enemy. It would help allies, our allies, be more helpful to us. Our British friends are the best friends you could hope to have, and they've had a hard time with our detainee policy. So we've got every reason in the world to want to start over, but the Congress is right not to allow us to start over until we have a plan. The Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, is absolutely right to keep Guantanamo Bay open until we have a complete plan. And I do believe this President understands how to move forward with Guantanamo Bay. The best way to move forward, in my opinion, is to collaborate with the Congress. Look at the military commission system, which I think is the proper venue to dispose of any war crimes trials. Remember, these people that we're talking about have been accused of taking up arms against the United States. They're non-citizen enemy combatants who are who represent a military threat. And military commissions have been used to try people like this for hundreds of years. We did trials with German saboteurs who landed on the east coast of the United States with the purpose of sabotaging our industries. They were captured and tried in military commissions. So there's nothing new about the idea of a military commission being used against an enemy force. But I do think the President is right to reform the current commission. I, along with Senator McCain, Warner, and others, Senator Levin particularly, we had a bill that set up a military commission process that received complete Democratic support on the Armed Services Committee and 4 Republicans. I think that document is worth going back to, and the ideas that the President has put on the table about reforming the Commission, quite frankly, make a lot of sense to me. So we do need to move forward. We do need to start over. If we could start over with new detention policy that's comprehensive, it would help our war effort. It would help operations in the countries in question, in the Mideast at large. It would repair damage with our allies. And quite frankly, we've lost a lot of court decisions. It would give us a better chance to win in court. Now, what do I mean by starting over? Come up with a disposition plan that understands that the detainees at Guantanamo Bay represent a military threat, and apply the law of armed conflict to their cases. That means you have to treat them humanely. The Geneva Convention now applies to detainees, Common Article 3, held at Guantanamo Bay based on a 2006 Supreme Court decision. We're bound by that convention because we're the leader of the convention. We have signed up to the convention. As a military lawyer for 25 years, I hold the Geneva Convention dear to my heart, as every military member does, because it will provide protections to our troops in future wars. And yes, I know Al-Qaeda will not abide by the conventions, but quite frankly, that is no excuse for us to abandon what we believe in. When you capture an enemy prisoner, it becomes about you, not them. They don't deserve much, but we have to be Americans to win this war. And there are plenty of people in this world that would cut your head off without a trial. I want to show the world a better way, and how we dispose of these prisoners can really help us in the overall ideological struggle. So what I am proposing is that we come up with a comprehensive plan, that we reform the military commissions, that the President come back to the Congress and we have another shot at the commissions to make them more due process friendly, but we realize that the people we're trying are accused of war crimes, and we apply the law of armed conflict. I've been a military lawyer, as I said, for 25 years. The judges and the jurors and the lawyers that would administer justice in the military commission setting are the same people that administer justice to our own troops. It is a great legal forum. You have rights in the military legal system. You get free legal counsel. Usually cost is not an object. The men and women who wear the uniform, who serve as judge advocates, take a lot of pride in their job. They're great Americans. They're great officers. They believe in justice. And you've seen verdicts. The few verdicts we've had at Guantanamo Bay indicates that our juries are rational. Our military jurors do hold the prosecution to the standards of proof, and they balance the interest of all parties. Like I say, I've never been more impressed with the legal system than our military justice system. And military commissions need to be as much like a court-martial as possible, but just practicality dictates some differences. And the one thing under the Geneva Convention this body needs to understand, that it is illegal under the Geneva Convention to try an enemy prisoner in civilian court. Why is that? You're afraid that civilian justice, jurors and judges, will have revenge on their mind. They're not covered by the Geneva Convention. Participants in a military commission are covered by the convention. Every lawyer, every judge, every juror, they have an obligation to hold to the tenets of the convention, and any misconduct on their part in a trial could actually result in prosecution to them or disciplinary action. That would not be true in the civilian world. So having these trials in a military commission setting is the proper venue because they're accused of war crimes. Having the trials in military commissions is consistent with the Geneva Convention. It is a world-class justice system, and quite frankly, it's the best place to balance our national security interest. But to the hard part. We can do that. We can reform the commissions, and some of these detainees can be repatriated back to third countries in a way I think is rational and will not hurt our national security interest. But there's going to be a group of detainees, maybe half or more, that the evidence is sound and certain that they're a member of Al-Qaeda, but it's not of the type that you would want to go to a criminal trial with. It may have third country intelligence service information where the third country would not participate in criminal trial because it would compromise their operations. Some type evidence would be such as you would not disclose it in a criminal trial, because it would compromise national security. And you have to remember, when you try someone criminally, you have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to share the evidence with the defendant. You have to go through the rigors of a criminal prosecution under a military commission. People are presumed innocent, and that's the way it should be. But I want America to understand that we're not charging everyone as a war criminal. We're making the accusation that you're a member of Al-Qaeda. And in military law, what you have to do if you're accusing someone of being part of the enemy force is prove by preponderance of the evidence that you are in fact a part of the enemy force. So what I would propose is to set up a hybrid system where every detainee, once determined to be an enemy combatant by our military or CIA, there'll be a process to do that, a combat status review tribunal, and we need to improve that process. But you run each detainee through that process, and if the military labels them as an enemy combatant, unlawful enemy combatant member of Al-Qaeda, then we'll do something we've never done in any other war, and that's allow that detainee to go into federal court. Under Article 5 of the Geneva Convention, status determinations are made by the military, not civilian judges, and it's usually done by an independent member of the military in an administrative setting. These are administrative hearings. But this war is different. There will never be an end to this war, Mr. President. We'll never have a signing on the Missouri like we did in World War II. I realize that an enemy combatant determination could be a de facto life sentence. So I'm willing to build in more due process to accommodate the nature of this war. So what I've proposed is that every detainee determined to be an enemy combatant by our military would go to a group of federal judges with uniform standards where the government would have to prove to an independent judiciary beyond a reasonable, by preponderance of the evidence, that the person is in fact an enemy combatant. And if our civilian judges who are trained in reviewing evidence agrees with the military, that person can be kept off the battlefield as long as there's a military threat. About 12% of the detainees released from Guantanamo Bay have gone back to the fight. The number 2 Al-Qaeda operative in Somalia is a former Gitmo detainee. And it is true we put people in Gitmo, in my opinion, where the net was cast too large and they were not properly identified. You're going to make mistakes. What I want to do is have a process that our nation could be proud of, transparent, robust due process, an independent judiciary checking and balancing the military, but never losing sight that the goal is to make sure that the determination of enemy combatant is well-founded, and if it is, not to release people back to the fight knowing they're going to go back and kill Americans. That doesn't make us a better nation to have a process where you have to let people go when the evidence is sound and clear they're going to go back to the fight. That does not make us a better people. That is stupid, and you do not have to do that under the law of armed conflict. So let's come up with a new system that will give every detainee a full and fair hearing in federal court. If they're tried for war crimes, put them in a new military commission, and every verdict would be appealed to our civilian judges. Let these trials be as transparent as possible. Let's balance national security against due process, but never lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with people who have taken up arms against the United States. Some of these people are so radical and their heart has been hardened so much, they're so hate-filled that it would be a disaster to this country and the world at large to let them go in the condition that exists today. Where to put them? 400,000 German prisoners and Japanese prisoners were housed in the United States during World War II. 15 to 20%, according to the historical record, were hardened Nazis. A hardened Nazi is at the top of the pecking order when it comes to mass murder. Now, the idea that we cannot find a place to securely house 250 plus detainees within the United States is not rational. We have done this before. They're not 10 feet tall, but it is my belief that you need a plan before you close Gitmo, and when you look at a new facility, it needs to be run by the military, because under the Geneva Convention you cannot house enemy prisoners in civilian jails. So I look forward to working with the President of the United States to start over. But we need a plan, Mr. President, to start over. A plan to try these people consistent with the law of armed conflict in a military commission that's reformed, that will administer justice fairly and balanced but also will realize that these people present a military threat. We need a system to allow us to keep off the battlefield committed jihadists that will allow them to have their day in court with an independent judiciary, but also will allow a process to keep them off the battlefield as long as they're dangerous. And if the judges agree with the military and enemy combatant, you should have an annual review process to determine whether or not you still present a military threat. No one should be held without a pathway forward, but no one should be released because you think this is a crime we're dealing with. If you criminalize this war and not use the law of armed conflict, you're going to make huge mistakes. There are countries that have terrorist suspects in jail right now that are about to have to release them because under criminal law you can't hold a person indefinitely without trial, nor should you. But under military law you can hold the enemy force off the battlefield if they're properly identified as part of the enemy force as long as they're a military threat. That has been the law for hundreds of years, and that ought to be the law that we apply. Where we put these people is important. But it's more important as to what we do with them, how we try them, how we detain them. We have a chance to show the world there's a better way. We have a chance to showcase our values. Yes, give them lawyers. Put the evidence against them under scrutiny. Put burdens on ourselves. Make us prove the case, not just say it so. Make us prove it in a court appropriate for the venue that we're talking about, appropriate for the decisions that we're about to make. Put that burden on us. Treat them humanely, because that's the way we are. That may not be the way they are, but that's the way we are, and that makes us better than them. The fact that we will do all these things and they won't is a strength of this nation, not a weakness. And some people in the past have lost sight of that. The fact we give them lawyers and a trial based on the evidence, not prejudice and passion, makes us strong. We will find a better way to do what we have been doing in the past. We will find a way to close Gitmo. We will come up with a new plan because we're Americans, and we're committed to our value system, and we're committed to beating this enemy. So I look forward to working with members of this body to come up with a comprehensive disposition plan that will find a new way to try these people, a new process to hold them off the battlefield, always operating within our values, that will allow our commanders the chance to start over in the region. And every military commander I've talked to said it would be beneficial to this country to start over with detainee policy, but they also understand we're at war and we need to have a national security-centric system. As to where we put them, not in my backyard. There were 6 prison camps in South Carolina during World War II. There's a brig in Charleston, near Charleston, the city of Charleston, a naval brig. It's not the location because it's near a population center. The place I have in mind is an isolated part of the United States, if necessary, that will be run by the military with a secure perimeter that will be operated within the Geneva Convention requirements, that will have a justice system attached to it that will be transparent and open, where we can administer justice and reattach our nation to the values that we hold so dear. Part of war is capturing prisoners. That is part of war. We know what the other side does when they capture a prison. Let the world know, a prisoner, let the world know that America has a better way. A way that will not only make us safe, but help us win this war. In conclusion, Mr. President, the goal of this effort to start over is to undermine the enemy's propaganda that's been used against us because of our past mistakes. Allow our allies to come join us in a new way forward. Protect us against a vicious enemy that needs to be held off the battlefield, maybe forever. Some of these people literally are going to die in jail, and that's okay with me. Because if we ever let them out of jail, they'd go back killing Americans, our friends, and our allies. I will not shed a tear. The way to avoid getting killed or going to jail forever is don't join Al-Qaeda. And if you make that decision to do so, let it be said that this nation is going to stand up to you and fight back within our value systems. So some of these people will never see the light of day, and that is the right decision. Some of them can be released. Let's have a process that understands what we're trying to do as a nation. make sure it's national security oriented, make sure it lives within our value system, but also understand that everything we do is as a result of a nation that's been attacked by these people. They have not robbed a liquor store. They have tried to destroy our way of life. The legal system I am proposing recognizes that distinction. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise to express my strong support for the Inouye-Inhofe amendment and would suggest to my colleagues that this should not be a controversial amendment. In fact, I commend my colleagues on the Democrat side for recognizing the futility of trying to put funding in the bill that we are debating here without having a plan with which to close Guantanamo Bay. And it seems to me, at least, Mr. President, a number have gotten up and argued that having Guantanamo Bay open as a detention facility for terrorists somehow makes the country less safe. I would argue the contrary, that did not exist prior to the attack anyway. The people who want to attack us don't need an excuse. They are going to attack us anyway. They're going to attack us because they hate us. They're going to attack us because they hate our way of life and the things that we stand for, and because that's what they do. They have hate in their hearts. And so, Mr. President, I believe that we need to have a place where we can detain people like that. It seems to me, at least, that the Guantanamo Bay facility fits perfectly within the definition of what makes sense. It's a state-of-the-art facility. It's a $200 million facility. No one has ever escaped from it. It is a very secure facility. It is hundreds of miles away from American communities. And the one thing I will point out to my colleagues in the Senate is that we have already expressed our view here in the United States Senate about whether or not these detainees ought to be transferred somewhere here into American society and into facilities in American communities and neighborhoods. Back in 2007, in July of that year, we took a vote here in the United States Senate, and by a vote of 94-3, United States senators voted in favor of the resolution that would prevent these detainees from coming here, from being released into American society and transferred into facilities in American communities and neighborhoods. And those in favor of that resolution at the time include both the current Vice President of the United States and the current Secretary of State. Now, my hope would be that this amendment that has been offered by the Senator from Oklahoma and the Senator from Hawaii will receive that same measure of support that was accorded to the amendment that was adopted here in the Senate back in July of 2007 by a vote of 94-3. It should say, this amendment should receive that same measure of support, Mr. President. As I noted last week in a speech on the floor, President Obama told us when he issued his January 22nd executive order to close Guantanamo that he would work with Congress on any legislation that might be appropriate. But instead of consulting the Congress, the President has asked for $80 million to close Guantanamo with no justification or indication of any plan. Now, I believe that any plan to close Guantanamo that includes bringing these terrorists into the United States, Mr. President, is a mistake. We don't want the killers who are held there to be brought here into our communities. I think it's deeply troubling that not only does the administration wish to hold open the possibility that some of these detainees may be transferred to facilities here in American communities, it is even considering freeing some of them into American society. These are the 17 Chinese Uyghurs whose Combat Status Review Tribunal records were deemed insufficient to support the conclusion that they are enemy combatants, but cannot be returned to China because of fear that the Chinese government will torture or kill them. Now, at a press conference on March 26, Admiral Dennis Blair, the Director of National Intelligence, went so far as to say, and I quote, that if we are to release them, the Uyghurs, in the United States, we need some sort of assistance for them to start a new life, end quote. Now, it's hard to believe that this administration is seriously considering freeing these men inside the United States, and most outrageous of all, paying them to live freely within American communities and neighborhoods. The American people don't want these men walking the streets of America's neighborhoods. Mr. President, the American people don't want these detainees held at a military base or a federal prison in their backyard either. These aren't common criminals. These are hardened killers bent on the destruction of the United States. These are people who are resourceful. These are people who are innovative. These are people who understand the strategic vulnerabilities of the United States and how to exploit those very vulnerabilities. Who would have predicted that this group of people would basically be able to steal a fleet of planes and cause death and destruction on the scale and magnitude of Pearl Harbor? It's hard to imagine a more dangerous set of circumstances and stresses to put upon an American community. Mr. President, since President Obama seems set on a course to bring these terrorists into the United States, I strongly support the efforts of Senator Inhofe and Senator Inouye to introduce this amendment. This amendment would prevent any funding in this bill from being used to transfer detainees held at Guantanamo Bay to any facility in the United States, or to construct, improve, modify, or otherwise enhance any facility in the United States for the purpose of housing any Guantanamo detainees. If we must close Guantanamo Bay, it should not result in Americans being less safe. Bringing these detainees to the United States, Mr. President, would make Americans less safe, and we should not do it. Transferring these detainees would also stress the civilian governments in the communities where the detainees would be placed. These communities would be faced with overwhelming demands, from roadblocks to identification checks, along with having increased security personnel necessary to deal with what is an obvious threat. The value of homes and businesses would decline. Now, I can tell you, Mr. President, that South Dakotans definitely don't want these detainees in their state. And I hope that my support of the Inouye-Inhofe amendment will help to ensure that they will not be transferred to South Dakota or to anywhere else in the United States. My view is that no Guantanamo detainees should be brought here to this country to be incarcerated, and certainly should not be brought into the United States and freed. The Senate has clearly spoken on that front, as I said earlier, by a vote of 94-3 on a resolution in July of 2007 that detainees housed at Guantanamo Bay should not be released into American society and not transferred stateside into facilities in American communities and neighborhoods. Mr. President, Guantanamo is secure. The facility is a $200 million state-of-the-art prison. No one has ever escaped, and the location makes it extremely difficult to attack. Best of all, it's located hundreds of miles from American communities. Now, if the President wants to close Guantanamo, he must do so in a way that keeps America safe. In my view, Mr. President, America is less safe if Guantanamo detainees are brought into the United States. And so I appreciate the hard work of Senator Inhofe, Senator Inouye on this issue. And I hope that when we have the vote today, Mr. President, that my colleagues will adopt this amendment with the same level of support that we adopted the resolution back in July of 2007 by a vote of 94-3, stating very clearly the view of the United States Senate that these detainees should not be brought into American communities, into American neighborhoods. Mr. President, I would argue that they ought to be held right where they are, in a place that is safe, that is secure, that is state-of-the-art, where they receive the very best of treatment, where no one has ever escaped, hundreds of miles away from American communities and neighborhoods. Mr. President, I hope my colleagues will support this amendment, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Illinois.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, it's my understanding we're on the supplemental appropriations bill at this point. Thank you, Mr. President. I want the record to show that I support President Obama's supplemental request for the remainder of the year 2000, the fiscal year 2009. This supplemental provides critical funding for military and security efforts in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. A small portion is for international programs, including assistance to Jordan, one of our important allies in the Middle East. Jordan is struggling with a huge influx of Iraqi refugees that strains its national services and particularly its water resources. Jordan has been a friend and an ally. It is right that in the supplemental bill we give them a helping hand, that the war in Iraq has created a situation which we should address in Jordan. It also provides additional support to the Global Fund, which partners with other nations to tackle AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. I have worked with my colleagues for years to provide adequate funding for Global Fund, and I'm glad that this supplemental request from the Obama administration continues. Critical food assistance to help meet urgent needs of the world's poor is also included. Funding is provided to help stem the flow of drugs and violence across our border in Mexico. At home, the supplemental includes money to prepare for and to respond to a global disease pandemic, including the recent H1N1 influenza virus. This $1.5 billion went through my subcommittee, and it's money well spent so that the President can have the resources together to respond quickly to any outbreak of disease or pandemic, that we would have adequate money for vaccinations, as well as providing medications should people be stricken. We are looking ahead, planning ahead, thinking ahead, hoping that H1N1 will disappear from the world scene before the next flu season, but being prepared if it does not, or if something else threatens us. This bill also provides funds critical for helping President Obama meet a key campaign promise, bringing an end to the war in Iraq. In late February, President Obama made an important announcement to thousands of Marines at Camp Lejeune about the war in Iraq. After only 5 weeks into office, he delivered on his major campaign promise to end one of the longest wars in American history. The President's plan is measured, thoughtful, and will bring an end to this costly and unnecessary war. The supplemental also wisely shifts resources to the real sources of the September 11 attacks on America, Afghanistan. For too long, this war in Afghanistan did not receive adequate civilian and military resources as they had been diverted to the war in Iraq. The supplemental corrects this mistake. It also focuses resources on Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation struggling with insurgents based in the border area with Afghanistan. It provides pay and allowances to our brave men and women in the U.S. military, and these are some of the many important needs which deserve our support. The President should be commended for recently presenting a budget for 2010, which moves away from repeated supplementals. This got to be a habit around here. We didn't go through an orderly debate on the budget about wars. Every time President Bush wanted money for a war, he'd say, I'm declaring this an emergency. It'll not be considered in the ordinary budget process. Here it is. Well, an emergency is defined as something unanticipated. And after 5 or 6 years of emergencies, you begin to realize we can anticipate next year we're going to have another unanticipated emergency. Well, President Obama wants to change that so that we go to an orderly budget process. This supplemental bill will be the last that he requests, and I think it is one that we should honor as he tries to tackle some situations that were given to him when he took office just a few months ago. The President inherited many challenges at home and abroad, and I hope on a bipartisan basis we can help him address them. Mr. President, this supplemental appropriation bill provides critical funding for our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I hope that Congress passes it. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have decided to use this legislation primarily to debate the future of Guantanamo. They have filed a number of amendments related to this issue. I'm not sure it's their intention, but these amendments will have the effect of slowing down delivery of critical funding for our troops. Nevertheless, it is their right to offer these amendments, and though they are not germane to this legislation, they raise policy questions which we can debate. Senator Inouye, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, has offered an amendment which has broad support on both sides of the aisle that will eliminate any funding in this bill for closing Guantanamo and making clear that none of the funds can be used to transfer Guantanamo detainees to the United States. Now, here's the bottom line. There will not be any Guantanamo funding in this bill. So for the Republicans to bring us a series of Guantanamo amendments tells me that they're more intent on raising an issue than on responding to a critical need that this supplemental addresses. These amendments are also premature. President Obama has not yet presented his plan for closing Guantanamo to the Congress or the American people. When he does, we're sure going to have plenty of opportunity to debate it. This bill, which will provide critical funding for our troops, is not the right place for this debate. This is not the right time. In fact, some of the amendments would have the effect of tying President Obama's hands, preventing him from moving forward with the closure of Guantanamo before he's even had the chance to present his plan. There's a great irony here. For 8 long years, Republicans opposed congressional oversight of the Bush administration's counterterrorism efforts. when Democrats in the minority during the Bush years would ask for oversight by congressional committees so that we could get more information about a variety of issues relative to terrorism, we were told, no, the president has an important job to do, and don't bother him, Congress, leave him alone. For 8 years, Republicans criticized Democrats who asked questions about the misguided war in Iraq and controversial policies related to interrogation, detention, and warrantless surveillance. And for 8 years, they claimed that congressional oversight was nothing more than micromanaging the important, critical work of the commander-in-chief. Now, after 8 long years, the Republicans with these amendments are unwilling to give President Obama a few short months to formulate and present a plan for closing Guantanamo. Let's take one example. The distinguished minority leader, Senator McConnell, has offered an amendment that would require the president to submit a detailed report to Congress on each detainee at Guantanamo Bay, including a summary of the evidence against each detainee. Now, for many years, the Bush administration refused to provide Congress with even a list of the names of the detainees at Guantanamo. They claimed that a disclosure of those names would threaten national security. I don't recall Senator McConnell or anyone from his side of the aisle protesting this lack of disclosure by the previous administration. Yesterday, Senator McConnell said his amendment is designed to prevent released Guantanamo detainees from getting involved in terrorism. He said, quote, recidivism is of great concern for those of us who have oversight responsibilities here in Congress, end of quote. I do not recall Senator McConnell or any other Republican protesting when the Bush administration, over the course of many years, literally released hundreds of Guantanamo detainees, some of whom had actually been involved in acts of terrorism since they were released. So during the Bush years, while Guantanamo was churning hundreds of detainees, some being released and returned to their countries, not a whimper or a peep from the Republican side of the aisle. Now that President Obama has said the days of Guantanamo are numbered, they're coming in asking for detailed accounting of every single detainee. It's clearly a double standard. There's also concern that the McConnell amendment could taint prosecutions of Guantanamo detainees by requiring the Obama administration to turn over critical evidence to Congress. Imagine for a moment that we've gathered evidence that can be used successfully to either detain or prosecute one of the detainees, and Senator McConnell insists that it be made public and shared with members of Congress. Now, is that in the interest of national security? I don't think so. For 7 years after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration failed to convict any of the terrorists who planned these attacks. At President Obama's directions, career prosecutors are now reviewing the files of each Guantanamo detainee and gathering evidence to determine if each detainee can be prosecuted. Isn't that what we want? An orderly process looking at each detainee to determine whether or not they're guilty of wrongdoing, decide whether or not they can be prosecuted, whether or not they should be detained, and doing this with the understanding that a lot of the information is classified and most of it should be carefully guarded so as not to jeopardize the prosecution. The McConnell amendment would say, well, let's just open the books. Let Congress take a look at each detainee and all the evidence. That doesn't make sense. And I hope that the members of the Senate will reject it. The last thing Congress should do is interfere with the Obama administration's efforts to gather evidence against terrorists that could ultimately bring them to justice. Now, there's another amendment. Senator John Cornyn of Texas has an amendment that has 18 detailed findings about the Bush administration's use of abusive interrogation techniques like waterboarding. Among other things, the Cornyn amendment claims that these techniques, quote, accomplish the goal of providing intelligence necessary to defeat additional terrorist attacks against the United States. To say the least, we could debate that proposition for quite some time. Former Vice President Cheney has been burning up the cable channel airwaves in recent weeks. He claims that waterboarding produced valuable intelligence in the interrogation of al-Qaeda leader Abu Zubaydah. But back in 2004, Vice President Cheney also told us the Bush administration had learned from interrogations at Guantanamo that the Iraqi government had trained al-Qaeda in the use of biological and chemical weapons. We now know there was never a link between al-Qaeda and Iraq. This was part of the justification for the invasion of Iraq, and Vice President Cheney told us that the interrogation at Guantanamo was producing the information to confirm a link that never existed. What about Abu Zubaydah? Well, just last week in the Judiciary Committee, we heard testimony from a former FBI agent who actually interrogated him. He testified under oath in our committee that he obtained valuable intelligence from Abu Zubaydah using traditional interrogation techniques, and that abusive techniques like waterboarding are, quote, harmful, slow, ineffective, and unreliable. Senator Cornyn doesn't serve on the Intelligence Committee. I don't know the basis for his claim that waterboarding produced intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks. I do know the Intelligence Committee, under Senator Dianne Feinstein's leadership, is now conducting a detailed, thoughtful, and thorough investigation into the Bush administration's detention and interrogation practices. I have said publicly, others have said it as well, including the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, that before we talk about creating an outside commission, the Senate Intelligence Committee should be allowed to do its work so that members of Congress can at least learn through open and classified information what did happen. But Senator Cornyn can't wait. Senator Cornyn wants to pass out get-out-of-jail-free cards across the previous administration before we even have a thorough examination of what happened. One of the things that the Intelligence Committee is reviewing is the effectiveness of techniques in obtaining intelligence. The Senate is certainly not in a position today to go on record with conclusions like those in Senator Cornyn's amendment before the Intelligence Committee even completes its investigation. It's not only premature, it's certainly questionable as to whether or not we should be engaged in this debate until their work is done. I might remind Senator Cornyn and those following this debate, the Intelligence Committee is a bipartisan committee. It works in a bipartisan fashion. Senator Bond and Senator Feinstein and others can continue to work together. Provide Senate with good evidence before we jump at the Cornyn Amendment, which reaches conclusions not based on fact. Senator Cornyn's amendment also expresses a sense of the Senate that no one involved in authorizing the use of abusive interrogation techniques like waterboarding should ever be prosecuted or sanctioned. Mr. President, that is inappropriate for Congress to interfere in ongoing investigations by the Justice Department. During the Bush administration, political interference significantly undermined the credibility and effectiveness of the Justice Department. Attorney General Holder has pledged to restore the integrity and the independence of that department. There are two ongoing investigations into the Bush administration's interrogation practices. One's looking into the CIA's destruction of evidence of interrogation videotapes. The other's an investigation of Justice Department attorneys who authorized abusive techniques like waterboarding. Now, here's the reality. Both of these investigations didn't begin under President Obama. They began under the Bush administration. And both are being conducted by Department of Justice attorneys. So the suggestions that this is some partisan witch hunt are obviously false. You just wonder, with these two Department of Justice investigations underway, and with the Senate Intelligence Committee doing a thorough investigation of this subject, why Senator Cornyn wants to come to the floor and have the United States Senate go on record saying that nothing possibly could have been done that was illegal or wrong. That is the height of irresponsibility should we pass that amendment. Decisions about whether crimes were committed should be made by career prosecutors based on the facts and the laws, not political considerations or statements made by senators on the floor without evidence to back them up. I urge my colleague from Texas to withdraw his amendment and allow the Justice Department to do its work. I would say, Mr. President, that there's an organization which I like and respect very much called Amnesty International. Well, when you take a look at John Cornyn's amendment, he would qualify for some amnesty award because he wants the Senate to go on record offering amnesty when it comes to the interrogation of detainees, not only, let me go through the list here, not only to any person who relied in good faith on those opinions at any level of our government, also includes members of Congress who were briefed on the interrogation program. You know, to offer this kind of a statement ahead of time without any gathering of evidence or fact is, in my mind, an indication of how nervous some people are on the other side of the aisle. We should let this run its course in a professional manner. We shouldn't make a political decision, and we should defeat the Cornyn Amendment. Several of my Republican colleagues came to the floor yesterday to criticize President Obama's intention to close Guantanamo and argue it should remain open. I listened carefully to their arguments, and frankly, there were enough detainees at Guantanamo. One of my colleagues said that President Obama wants to close Guantanamo, quote, to be more popular with the Europeans, close quote. Well, I know President Obama. I served with him. He was my colleague in the Senate. His first interest is the United States and its safety. But the safety of the United States also involves being honest about what's happened. What happened at Abu Ghraib and what happened at Guantanamo has sullied the reputation of the United States and has endangered alliances which we've counted on for decades. President Obama is trying to change that. By closing Guantanamo and responsibly allocating those detainees to safe and secure positions, he is going to send a message to the world that it's a new day in terms of America's foreign policy. The American people want to see that. They want a safer world and believe that if the United States can work closely with our allies around the world who are opposed to terrorism, that we will be safer. That's what President Obama is setting out to do. Some of those allies may in fact be European. They may be African. They may be Asian. They could be from all corners of the earth. But if they share our values and want to work to common goals, President Obama wants to work with them. General Colin Powell and many other military leaders have said publicly for some time now that closing Guantanamo will make America safer. Experts say that Guantanamo is a recruitment tool for al-Qaeda and hurts our national security. That's why President Obama, like President Bush, who said the same thing, Senator John McCain, and many others want to close Guantanamo. Some of my Republican colleagues argued that Guantanamo is the only appropriate place to hold the detainees, and they said, and I quote, "We don't have a facility that could handle this in the United States," end of quote. And American prison guards, they went on to say, quote, "have no idea what they're getting into," close quote. Well, I would just say to my colleagues who made those statements, you ought to take a look at some of our security facilities in the United States, and you ought to have a little more respect for the men and women who are corrections officers who put their lives on the line every single day to keep us safe and to make sure that those who are dangerous are detained and incarcerated. The reality is we are holding some of the most dangerous terrorists in the world right now in our federal prisons, including the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the shoe bomber, the Unabomber, and many others. Senator McConnell said yesterday, and I quote, "No one has ever escaped from Guantanamo," end of quote. Well, that's true to the best of my knowledge, but it's also true that no prisoner has ever escaped from a federal super maximum security facility in the United States. In fact, the Bureau of Prisons is currently holding 347 convicted terrorists. Is Senator McConnell going to come to the floor and say that they should be moved from these federal correctional facilities because they pose a threat to the United States, being incarcerated here in the continental United States? Haven't heard that. But in his effort to keep Guantanamo open at any cost, he wouldn't even consider allowing a detainee to be brought to the United States for trial and being held even temporarily in any type of secure facility. Republicans are criticizing the president, but the reality is they don't have a plan themselves to deal with Guantanamo. I assume from Senator McConnell's statements, he'd just leave it open. He doesn't care the impact that this might have on the United States around the world. If he has a plan to close it, I'd like to hear it. I think you ought to come forward and join with President Bush, join with President Obama, join General Powell, join Senator McCain, Senator Graham, and others who've said that Guantanamo should be closed. Make it clear where he stands. Otherwise, unfortunately, he's being critical of the president's intentions without producing his own approach. The Bush administration had many years to deal with Guantanamo, but they didn't follow through. President Obama has taken on the challenge of solving one of the toughest challenges and problems that his administration faced beyond the state of our economy. The president's taking the time to carefully plan for the closure of Guantanamo, with the highest priority being the protection of America's national security. I urge my Republican colleagues to withdraw these Guantanamo amendments. These amendments don't fit in the supplemental appropriation bill. They tie the president's hand to make the right decision to keep us safe and to make sure that terrorists do not in any way threaten the United States. And they slow down our efforts to provide critical funding for our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mr. President, I hope when this matter comes before the Senate in the hours ahead that my colleagues will read carefully and closely, particularly the amendments by Senator Cornyn and by Senator McConnell. The amendment by Senator Cornyn, which grants a sense of the Senate amnesty to those who were involved in interrogation techniques, is not consistent with a nation that is guided by the rule of law. For that senator to make conclusions in his amendment that have not been supported by evidence, in fact, should be grounds enough for us to reject his amendment. I don't know where these investigations in the Department of Justice or the Intelligence Committee will lead, but if we are truly sworn to uphold the Constitution and the laws of our land, we should allow them to run their course, with the facts and the law be honestly considered by those different panels. Senator McConnell's amendment, which asks for more detailed information about detainees at Guantanamo than any Republican ever dared ask under the Bush administration, could jeopardize the prosecution of terrorists. Is that a good idea? It's certainly not. And I certainly hope that my colleagues will join me in opposing the McConnell amendment as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
I rise to speak about Senate Amendment 1144, the Protecting America's Communities Act, which I am offering to H.R. 2346, a supplemental appropriation bill. Before I begin my comments, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add Senator Coburn as an original co-sponsor of S. 1071, which is a collateral standalone bill, as well as as a co-sponsor of amendment number 1144.
Without objection.
This amendment amends immigration law to prohibit any detainee held at Guantanamo Bay Naval Facility from being transferred or released into the United States. A little bit different from the vote that we're going to be taking at 11:30. Today, there are over 240 terrorists in U.S. custody at the military detention facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Let me just describe some of the individuals who reside at Guantanamo. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, is the self-proclaimed and quite unapologetic mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. KSM admitted he was the planner of 9/11 and other planned but foiled attacks against the United States. In his Combatant Status Review Board, he admitted he swore allegiance to Osama bin Laden, was a member of al-Qaeda, was the military operational commander for all foreign al-Qaeda operations, and much more. KSM and 4 other detainees who are charged with conspiring to commit the terrible 9/11 attacks remain at Guantanamo. In addition, Gitmo houses Abad al-Rahim al-Nashri, who was responsible for the October 2000 USS Cole bombing, which murdered 17 U.S. sailors and injured 37 others. Also residing at Gitmo are Osama bin Laden's personal bodyguards, al-Qaeda terrorist camp trainers, al-Qaeda bomb makers, and individuals picked up on the battlefield with weapons trying to kill American soldiers, our young men and women who patriotically serve their country. The detainees at Guantanamo are some of the most senior, hardened, and dangerous al-Qaeda figures that we have captured. These are exactly the type of individuals we hope never get past our front lines and enter into the United States. However, as one of the very first acts in January, President Obama ordered the closure of Guantanamo, but 4 months later, he still does not have a plan to accomplish this. Officials in his administration have stated publicly that some of these detainees could be brought to the United States, and some could even be freed into the United States. The disposition of the detainees at Guantanamo is not a new issue. Over the past several years, the military has transferred the majority of detainees held at Gitmo to other countries. However, the success of these transfers is mixed at best. According to a Defense Intelligence Agency report from December 2008, 18 former detainees are confirmed and 43 are suspected of returning to the fight after being released from Guantanamo. This represents a recidivism rate of over 11%. Just 2 months later, this figure rose to 12%. These individuals do not even represent the most serious and dangerous terrorists that we have captured. The most dangerous detainees remain at Gitmo. This data has likely risen since December, but the Department of Defense refuses to release the information under instructions from the administration. If we start to release or transfer the most hardened terrorists left at Guantanamo, these numbers will only increase further. One thing that is clear, we know that these detainees have remained loyal to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, despite being captured, and remain a danger to our national security. We have statements from detainees avowing that it is their goal to kill Americans, claiming that they pray every day against the United States. Al-Qaeda searches every day for operatives who can invade our enhanced security mechanisms in its quest to commit another attack against our homeland. It is important to remember that most detainees held at Guantanamo were captured on the battlefields in Afghanistan or Iraq and were determined to be a threat to our nation's security. Whatever their ties to terrorist groups or activities, these individuals should never be given the privilege of crossing our borders, even if incarcerated. To do so would be nothing short of an invitation for al-Qaeda to operate inside our homeland. KSM and other high-value detainees at Gitmo are no different and do not conceal their intent to harm Americans if given the chance. My amendment would prevent those terrorists at Gitmo from ever having that chance. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the right to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. The Supreme Court has determined that the power of Congress to exclude aliens from the United States and to prescribe the terms and conditions on which they come in is absolute. My legislation capitalizes on the clear and absolute authority of Congress to determine who enters our borders by first adding to the list of those inadmissible to the United States those detained at Gitmo as of January 1 of this year. However, because Congress delegates to the executive branch parole authority, this administration could still bring those terrorists detained at Gitmo into the United States. Parole authority is granted to the Attorney General to allow aliens who are otherwise not qualified for admission to the United States permission to enter our country on a case-by-case basis, essentially a waiver for those who are otherwise inadmissible. Although aliens paroled into the United States are not considered admitted for purposes of our immigration laws, they are within the borders of our country and therefore become eligible to apply for asylum or seek other legal protections. To deal with this, my legislation also eliminates parole authority for the executive branch as it pertains to those individuals detained at Guantanamo as of January 1, 2009. As such, there is no basis for President Obama to allow these detainees to be transferred to U.S. soil. The Protecting America's Communities Act also provides protections for American citizens in the event that this president decides to try to exercise some other authority to bring these Guantanamo detainees to the United States, such as the authority granted him via Article 2 of our Constitution. Again, we know that if the detainees were transferred to the United States, they would seek legal protection under the generous legal rights our Constitution grants our citizens. However, our courts and our legal system were not established to try individuals detained on the battlefield. Because of the nature of the global war on terror and evidence gathered against them from the battlefield or through intelligence, the detainees are unlikely to be suitable for prosecution within the United States criminal courts. There is no CSI Kandahar in which evidence picked up off the battlefield is carefully marked and the chain of custody is observed. There is too much at stake to grant the unprecedented benefit of our legal system's complex procedural safeguards to foreign nationals who were captured outside the United States during a time of war. Allowing these terrorists to escape conviction, or worse yet, to be freed into the United States by our courts because of legal technicalities would tarnish the reputation of our legal system as one that is fair and just. Prohibiting the detainees from entering into the United States, as the Protecting America's Communities Act does, is one small step in the right direction. Further, if these individuals were to be brought to the United States by President Obama to be tried on our Article II courts and not convicted, the only mechanism available to our government to continue to detain these individuals would be via immigration law. However, the current immigration laws on our books are insufficient to ensure that these detainees would be mandatorily detained and continue to be detained until they can successfully be removed from our borders. Although I am adamantly opposed to bringing any of these detainees to the United States, and I do not believe that the President has independent authority to do so, I believe that we need legislation to safeguard our citizens and our communities in the event that they are brought here. To that end, my legislation makes mandatory the detention of any Gitmo detainee brought to the United States. It also strengthens and clarifies the authority of the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to detain any of these Gitmo detainees until they can be removed. This statutory fix is needed because in 2001, the Supreme Court decided the case of Zavedas v. Davis, holding that unless there is a reasonable likelihood that an alien being held by the government will actually be repatriated to their government within a given period of time, that alien must be released and cannot be detained by the United States government for more than 6 months. We all know that a major issue facing our country in dealing with these folks detained at Gitmo is finding a country to take them. For example, there are 17 Chinese Uyghurs being held at Gitmo that have been cleared for transfer to another country. However, the United States will not send them back to China for fear that they might be treated unfairly by the Chinese government, and no other country to date is willing to take them. Therefore, my legislation provides authority to the Secretary of Homeland Security to continue to detain these individuals and provides for a periodic review of their continued detention until they can safely be removed to a third country. In addition, my legislation prohibits any of these individuals detained at Gitmo for applying for asylum in the event that they are brought here. Now, there are a number of other proposals to prohibit funding from being used to transfer to or detain the Gitmo terrorists in the United States, and I'm going to support those provisions, but those are not permanent. Those will have to be renewed annually. Congress would have to maintain this prohibition in all future spending bills. Although I do believe this is a good short-term solution and I support those measures, I want to be confident that Congress does not drop the ball in the future. We need a more permanent solution to this problem, and the Protecting America's Communities Act provides exactly that. I urge the President to develop a policy that would allow closure for the families of the victims of 9/11, that will prevent terrorists from stepping foot on U.S. soil, and will keep them off the battlefield where they will attempt to kill our men and women in future combats. However, we cannot wait for the President to assure us that none of these detainees will be brought to America. The stakes are too high, and in order to maintain the highest degree of safety and security in our country, we need to adopt the Protect America's Communities Act to ensure that they never step foot inside of our nation. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I rise to give some views on Guantanamo. I've had the privilege of serving with the distinguished senator who just concluded his remarks on the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, but I really strongly disagree with him, and I would like to have the opportunity to make the case. Guantanamo, first of all, is not sovereign territory of the United States. Under a 1903 lease, the United States exercises complete jurisdiction and control, however, over this naval base. In December of 2001, the administration decided to bring detainees captured overseas in connection with the war in Afghanistan and hold them there outside of our legal system. That was the point. Hold them outside of our legal system. This is revealed in a December 2001 Office of Legal Counsel memoranda by John Yoo of the Justice Department. He wrote this: "Finally, the executive branch has repeatedly taken the position under various statutes that Guantanamo is neither part of the United States nor a possession or territory of the United States. For example, this office, Justice, has opined that Guantanamo is not part of the United States for purposes of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. Similarly, in 1929, the Attorney General opined that Guantanamo was not a possession of the United States within the meaning of certain tariff acts." The memo concludes with this statement: "For the foregoing reasons, we conclude that a district court cannot properly entertain an application for a writ of habeas corpus by an enemy alien detained by Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, Cuba. Because the issue has not yet definitively been resolved by the courts, however, we caution that there is some possibility that a district court would entertain such an application." This set the predicate for Guantanamo. Keep these people out of the reach of American federal law and set up our own law to deal with them separately from American law. Now, was this right or wrong? It was definitively wrong, because since then the Supreme Court rejected this position in 4 separate cases. 1, Rasul v. Bush in 2004. The court ruled that American courts in fact do have jurisdiction to hear habeas and other claims from detainees held at Guantanamo. 2, Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, also in 2004. The court upheld the president's authority to lawfully to detain unlawful combatants, but stated that this authority was not a blank check. In particular, the court ruled that detainees who were United States citizens, such as Yasser Hamdi is, had the rights that all Americans are guaranteed under the Constitution. 3, in Hamdan v. Rumsfeld in 2006, a constant chain of opinions, the court declared invalid the Pentagon's process for adjudicating detainees and extended to Guantanamo detainees the protection from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment found in Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. The administration responded by pushing through Congress the Military Commissions Act. This legislation expressly eliminated habeas corpus rights and limited other appeals to procedure and constitutionality, leaving questions of fact or violation of law unresolvable by all federal courts. This happens nowhere else in American law, but this Military Commissions Act was enacted in the fall of 2006. Now, the 4th opinion. That law was then challenged through the courts and overturned in the final Supreme Court decision in this area, Boudemien versus Bush, decided in 2008. In Boudemien, the Supreme Court stated that the writ of habeas corpus applied to detainees even when Congress had sought to take jurisdiction away. It stated that detainees must be allowed access to federal courts so that a judicial ruling on the lawfulness of their detention could be made. Writing for the majority in this Boudemien decision, Justice Kennedy wrote the following: "The laws and the Constitution are designed to survive and to remain in force in extraordinary times. Liberty and security can be reconciled, and in our system they are reconciled within the framework of the law. Several habeas petitions have in fact been filed and reviewed in the D.C. Circuit since the Boudemian decision, and that process is ongoing today. In sum, these 4 Supreme Court rulings make one thing exceedingly clear. The legal rights of these detainees are the same under the Constitution, whether they are kept on American soil or elsewhere. Attempts to diminish or deny these rights have only served to delay the legal process in Guantanamo. In fact, Mr. President, only 3 of the roughly 750 detainees held at Guantanamo have in fact been held to account for their actions. One is David Hicks, an Australian. He pled guilty and has since been released by the Australian government. Salim Hamdan, bin Laden's driver, was found guilty of providing material support for terrorism by his military commission. He was sentenced to 5.5 years, but having already served 5 years in Guantanamo, he was released to Yemen in November of 2008. El Hamza al-Bahlul, a Yemeni who was al-Qaeda's media chief, was found guilty of conspiracy and providing material support to terrorism in November of 2008. He refused to mount a defense in his own behalf and was given a life sentence. Now today, there are approximately 240 detainees at Guantanamo. In 2007, nearly 2 years ago, I introduced an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill to close Guantanamo within 1 year and transition all detainees out of that facility. The amendment was co-sponsored by 15 senators. Unfortunately, it was not allowed to come up for debate. Within 2 days of his inauguration, President Obama issued an executive order announcing the closure of Guantanamo within 1 year and ordering a review of each detainee. Let me say this. I believe that closing Guantanamo is in our nation's national security interests. Guantanamo is used not only by al-Qaeda, but by other nations, by governments, by individuals, by good people, by bad people, as a symbol of America's abuse of Muslims, and it's fanning the flames of anti-Americanism around the world. As former Navy General Counsel Alberto Mora said in 2008, serving United States flag officers maintain that the first and second identifiable cause of U.S. combat deaths in Iraq, as judged by their effectiveness in recruiting insurgent fighters into combat, are respectively the symbols of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. I deeply believe that closing Guantanamo is a very important part of the larger efforts against terror and extremism. It's a part of the effort to show that Americans are not hypocritical, that we do not pass laws and say, well, now there is a certain group of people who are exempt from these laws. Detention at Guantanamo has caused tension between the United States and our allies. The allies we try to get to contribute more forces and other support for the war in Afghanistan. And they are a rallying point for the recruitment of terrorists. So closing it is a critical step in restoring America's credibility abroad and restoring the value of our judicial system. The executive branch task force responsible for ensuring that Guantanamo closes within the year is reviewing the evidence on each of the roughly 240 detainees to determine the following. 1, who can be charged with a crime and be prosecuted? 2, who can be transferred to the custody of another country, like the 500 or so detainees who have already left Guantanamo? Who poses no threat to the United States but can't be sent to another nation. And finally, who cannot be released because they do pose a threat but can't be prosecuted, perhaps because the evidence against them is the inadmissible product of coercive interrogation. But let me be clear, no one is talking about releasing dangerous individuals into our communities or neighborhoods as some would have us believe. The best option is to prosecute the terrorists who plotted, facilitated, and carried out attacks against the United States. Now let's look at the record for a moment. Let's see where some of these people are. The United States has prosecuted individuals in federal court for the bombings of United States embassies and the 1993 World Trade Center attack. It has prosecuted individuals plotting to bomb airplanes, for attending terrorist training camps, and for inciting violent acts against the United States. According to this report, In Pursuit of Justice, Prosecuting Terrorist Cases in the Federal Courts, issued in May of last year, more than 100 terrorism cases since the beginning of 2001 have resulted in convictions. The individuals held at Guantanamo pose no greater threat to our security than these individuals convicted of these crimes who are currently held in prison in the United States and are no danger to our neighbors, our communities. The Bush administration has estimated that out of the 240 detainees at Guantanamo, 60 to 80 could be prosecuted for crimes against the United States or its allies. Current efforts to try these cases are ongoing. In the event that detainees cannot be tried in federal court or in standard courts-martial, the Obama administration has recently proposed revisions to military commissions. This is an issue that we're going to have to look at very closely in the coming weeks. Our system of justice is more than capable of prosecuting terrorists and housing detainees before, during, and after trial. We have the facilities to keep convicted terrorists behind bars indefinitely and keep them away from American citizens. The Obama administration will determine which civilian and military facilities are best to accomplish these goals. One example is the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. Here it is. It isn't in a neighborhood. It isn't in a community. It is an isolated Supermax facility. It has 490 beds. They are reserved for the worst of the worst. This facility houses not only drug kingpins, serial murderers, and gang leaders, but also terrorists who have already been convicted of crimes in this country. There have been no escapes, and it is far, as I said, from America's communities and neighborhoods, as are just about all of the maximum and supermax facility. This facility has housed terrorists like Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and at least 6 of his accomplices. Omar Abdul Rahman, known as the Blind Sheik, who was behind a plot to blow up New York City landmarks, including the United Nations. Richard Reed, the Al-Qaeda shoe bomber who tried to blow up an airliner in flight. 4 individuals involved in the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Ahmad Rassam, the Millennium Bomber, who was detained at the Canadian border with explosives in his car as he was headed to the Los Angeles airport. Lyman Ferris, the Al-Qaeda operator who plotted to blow up bridges in New York City. Jose Padilla, the United States citizen held for 3.5 years as an enemy combatant based on allegations that he had wanted to detonate a dirty bomb inside the United States, and was later convicted of material support to terrorism. 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, the Unabomber Theodore Kaczynski, and Oklahoma City bombers, one of whom is now deceased, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. These are but 20 of the 100. So there is ample evidence that the United States can, and in fact does, hold dangerous convicts securely and without incident. As I said earlier, I believe that not all detainees can be prosecuted. The Bush administration has identified a second group of 60 to 80 that could be transferred out of Guantanamo, if another nation could be found that would accept them. Again, the Obama administration is finding some success in moving these detainees abroad. Since January of this year, there have been stories indicating that certain European nations may accept some of the detainees. Just a few days ago, France accepted an Algerian detainee from Guantanamo. These countries recognize that closing Guantanamo is in the best interests of everyone and are willing to be part of the solution. We sincerely thank them. Finally, let me address the third category of detainee, which presents the thorniest problem. The Executive Order Task Force will likely determine that there are some detainees that can neither be tried nor transferred nor released. Secretary Gates recently testified that there were 50 to 100 of these detainees. The President has the authority to continue to detain such people under the laws of armed conflict, and he very well may need to exercise that authority, and I would support his doing so. In my view, this authority should be constrained and in keeping with the Geneva Conventions. Detainees should only be held following a finding by the executive branch that this action is legal under international law, and I believe it is legal. These detainees should have the right to have a United States court review this determination, such as the Boudemian decision guaranteed that habeas corpus of detainees will in fact be heard. That judicial determination should be reviewed periodically to determine whether the detainee remains a threat to national security and should be continued to be detained. In this, there is a protocol of what I've just said that I believe will stand court scrutiny and enable the President to continue detention of everyone that remains a national security threat to the United States. Mr. President, Guantanamo, despite all the rhetoric on this floor, has been a symbol of abuse and disregard for the rule of law for too long. 4 Supreme Court decisions should convince even the most recalcitrant of those among us. It is in our own national security interest that Guantanamo be closed as quickly and carefully as possible. The fact is that no member of Congress wants to see or advocates the reckless release of terrorists or anyone who's a threat to our national security into our communities. And it doesn't have to, and it won't be done that way. Of the 240 detainees at Guantanamo right now, some can be tried, some have been declared not to be enemy combatants, others may need to be detained in the future, but in a way that is consistent with our laws and our national security interests. I believe we should close Guantanamo So I support the president in this regard. I was able to get something into bills at one point, but it was eliminated later on. This is a very important decision we're going to make. I very much regret that this amount was in the supplemental bill without a plan, and I think that's the key. The plan wasn't there. How would the money be used? Nobody knew. So it fell smack dab into the trap that some want to spring throughout the United States. And that is that this administration or this United States Senate would release detainees into the neighborhoods and communities of the United States. This is not a neighborhood and community. And yes, we have maximum security prisons in California, eminently capable of holding these people as well, and from which people, trust me, do not escape. So I believe that this has really been an exercise in fear-baiting. I hope it's not going to be successful, because I believe that American justice is what makes this country strong in the eyes of the world. American justice is what people believe separates the United States from other countries. And American justice has to be applied to everyone, because if it isn't, we then become hypocrites in the eyes of the world. We should return to our values. And one of the largest symbols of returning to these values is, in fact, the closure of the facility at Guantanamo Bay. I thank the chair. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, how much time is remaining on our side?
15 minutes and 56 seconds. 15 minutes and 56 seconds.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be notified after 10 minutes and that the approximately 6 minutes be reserved for Senator Inhofe.
Reserving the right to object. And I don't think I will object, but I didn't get the request that you made. Would you repeat it, please?
It was
from
to
Texas.
Reserve the 10 minutes that I had scheduled and reserved 6 minutes for you.
And that 6 minutes would be immediately prior to Senator Inouye's closing. Is that right? Yeah, I do not object. Thank you.
Mr.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of the amendment to prohibit funds from the supplemental from being used for relocation of Guantanamo Bay prisoners. President Obama has asked for $100 million in the regular 2010 Defense Appropriations Bill for his proposal to close Guantanamo Bay. As Congress considers that plan for 2010, it is reasonable for us to ask the President to come to Congress with his plan so that we can consider the funding requirements as part of the normal oversight process. But right now, I think it is clear from all the debate that we have heard, the President does not have a plan. Instead, he is proceeding with a decision to close Guantanamo Bay, even though there is no viable alternative for the detainment of terrorist combatants. On September 11 of 2001, we know that the United States peered into the face of evil when 19 foreign terrorists brought the violence of extremism to our soil, claiming the lives of nearly 3,000 Americans. That day changed the course of American history. In the 8 years since, America has boldly waged the global war on terror in an effort to prevent terrorism from ever reaching American shores again. This conflict has presented our nation with operational challenges for which really we haven't seen before. It is where to and how to detain captured terrorists who are enemy combatants but really do not represent legal combatants of a country. They are not an organized military. They do not have the honor code that any military of a country has. No, they are terrorists They do not have an honor code, and therefore how and where we detain them has been a unique situation for our country. Included in the detainees at Guantanamo Bay is the self-confessed mastermind of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Since just after 9/11, these enemy combatants have been at a prison facility that is a United States naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. I have been there. Conditions are good. Medical service and food is good. Customs of the combatants are recognized and respected. My colleagues are discussing Guantanamo, saying that it is divisive, and they're talking about the whole issue of what is torture. I think it is very important that we separate what is torture from detaining enemy combatants that must be detained because they have information and because they are either suspects or known to be or self-confessed terrorists that want to harm and kill Americans and our allies. So as we are discussing the issue of where they're detained, I think we should put aside the issue of what is torture, which is a legitimate issue for discussion, but not in where these prisoners are housed. This issue should be, is this a secure facility? Are conditions clean? Do they meet the standards of any American prison? Does it protect Americans to hold them in a secure place from which it would be very difficult for them to escape? And one other point, because it has been brought out that we have secure prisons in America. Well, there is a difference here because you are putting these enemy combatants who do not have an honor code, you're putting them on American soil if that's the choice that's made, and you're also putting people who would then start plotting for their escape from the outside in America's neighborhoods. Mr. President, I believe that the President's initiative saying that we would close Guantanamo Bay within a year is premature, and I'm extremely concerned that this deadline, when there is no alternative and no plan for these dangerous terrorists, is taking precedence over the plan.
Tea times are the official start of what we love to.
They have been outlined here on the floor about what we would do with these detainees. Hand them over to their home countries for incarceration. Transfer them to a neutral country. Transfer them to a prison in America. Send them to U.S. facilities abroad or release them outright. Unfortunately, every one of these heighten the threat to the lives of Americans. Let's talk about putting them in America. That is the worst of these options. By taking this action, you do allow people who would plot the takeover of a prison or the escape of these detainees, you would put them in cell phone range where they could be talking to the outside. That would be the worst option. In 2007, the United States Senate voted 94-3, expressing its firm opposition to any plans to release Guantanamo detainees into American society or to house them in American facilities. So what about other countries? What about putting them out into other countries? That too is very dangerous. In January, it was reported that former Guantanamo detainee Saeed Ali al-Shari, who had been released into the custody of Saudi Arabia, has subsequently resurfaced as a terrorist operative. Today, he is one of the al-Qaeda leaders in Yemen and is charged with planning and executing acts of violence against the United States and its allies. And he is not the exception. According to the Pentagon, as many as 61 enemy combatants released from Guantanamo have since reconnected with terrorist networks and renewed their commitment to destroying America and our way of life. Even more frightening, these 61 former prisoners came from the group of 500 that were deemed less dangerous and were thus released. That means the approximately 270 detainees currently in Guantanamo represent the most nefarious of prisoners. Clearly, a viable alternative to Guantanamo has not been identified. Expediting closure of this detention facility without absolutely ensuring that American lives would be safe, not endangered by this act, would place misguided foreign policy goals above the protection of our homeland and our people. Moreover, it signals a dangerous return to pre-9/11 mindset. Before setting a deadline to close this camp at Guantanamo Bay, a U.S. naval base where they have been secured, from which there have been no escapes and no attempts to escape, before setting that deadline, the American people must be assured that the transfer or release of these detainees will not increase the risk to American citizens at home or abroad. As it stands, the administration cannot give that assurance today. We must require a plan before this order is executed. Not doing so is a pre-9/11 mentality that we cannot afford to adopt. We must remember what happened on 9/11. We were complacent. We were people that never thought that we would be attacked on our homeland by people even within this society who were helping to plot this destruction. We cannot go back to the mentality of everything is going to be okay and we won't be attacked again. There are people in Guantanamo and all over the world today that are plotting to undo the freedom in America and the ability to live with diversity and in peace. And we must hold that flag of America and what it represents for the world.
Senator has used 10 minutes.
That's what will make America good in the eyes of the world, not releasing terrorists to harm other people and our allies. Thank you, Mr. President, and now you yield the floor.
Mr. President?
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I'd like to inquire how much time we have before the senator from Hawaii wraps it up.
Senator from Oklahoma, it's 5 minutes.
All right. Mr. President, first of all, let me just say that on February 2nd, I was in Guantanamo Bay. This was several trips I've made down there, but I want to suggest that the first one I made was right after 9/11. At that time, I did quite a bit of research to see why is it this obsession people have about closing Guantanamo. And I looked at the resources down there, and I couldn't figure it out then, and that was several years ago. Now, just recently as 2 months ago, I still have a hard time figuring that out. And I'd like to suggest to you, and I've been listening to some of those who are objecting to the action that we're about to take today, there cannot be a case at all that there are human rights abuses in Guantanamo Bay. Eric Holder, the new Attorney General, went down there just a short while ago. He came back and he witnessed the same thing I did. He's down there about the same time. That during the recent visit, the military detention facilities at Gitmo meet the highest international standards and are in conformity with Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. Then in February 20th, a short time after that, Vice Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Walsh went down and issued a detailed report following a 2-week review. He was there for I go down for 1 day at a time. He was down there for 2 whole days with a whole team. The team conducted multiple announced and unannounced inspections of all the camps, daylight, nighttime, all that, keeping in mind there are 6 different levels of security down there, which is a resource that we can't find in any other of our installations that we'd have access to. But anyway, they talked to all the detainees and the guards and everyone else, and they found that their conditions conditions were in conformity with Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. So this shouldn't even be controversial. This is something that we all agree on. And number 4, I would suggest that we don't have any cases where people are being neglected. Right now, they have better health care than they've ever had before. There is a medical practitioner, a doctor, a nurse for each 2 detainees that are down there. There's even a lawyer for each detainee who's down there. And from their own statements to me, these individuals are eating better, living better than they have at any other time of their lives. Now, the big problem is, if we did close it, we'd have to do something with these people. And I heard one of the senators who's on the opposite side of this issue say a few minutes ago, well, that's fine, because right now they are disposing of them. They've only, in the last 3 months, found one place. It's dropped down from 241 to 240. And if that's a success story, I'm not sure I understand what success is. The bottom line is there are things down there that we can't replicate anywhere else, and they are being well cared for. One thing that hasn't been talked about enough is the existence of the Expeditionary Legal Complex that is in Gitmo. This took 12 months to build. It's $12 million, and this is where they can have tribunals. One of the problems, people are saying, well, they can be put into our justice system. You can't do that because these are detainees. They have, and tribunals have a different set of procedures that they use, and it has to be a special type of a court that's set up. Well, we do have that provision down there. We do have that court that's set up, and we are in the process of trying these people. So, you know, if you don't do this, there's a couple of choices, only 3 choices on getting rid of these people. One is you either leave them there and try them and try to adjudicate them, or you can send them out someplace. Well, we've already tried that. Countries won't receive these people, and I can't blame them. The third choice would be to somehow have them intermingled into our system here, set up in some 17, as they suggested, places for them. So none of the options are good. But this is one resource that has served America well. We've had it since 1903, and I asked my good friend, the senior senator from Hawaii, if he knows of any deal that America has that's better than this. It's $4,000 a year. That's all it costs us. So this is a resource that we need to keep. We have to keep. The only argument that I hear against it is, oh, the Europeans don't want that. Well, where are the Europeans? I'm getting a little bit tired of having them dictate what we do in the United States. What if they came forth and said, you have to close the Everglades tomorrow? Would we roll over and close the Everglades? No, we won't. So I think that there are a lot of options out there. This is by far the best option. And quite frankly, I go a lot further than this amendment. I think we need to keep this resource open. It's served us well in the past. It should serve us in the future. And I urge my fellow senators to support the Inouye-Inhofe amendment.
Senator's time has expired.
Madam President?
Senator from Hawaii.
Before proceeding with my remarks, I have 14 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and they be taken into the record.
Without objection.
That Mr. Robert Brzezinski, a detailee with the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, be granted floor privileges during the consideration of this measure.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss the Guantanamo Amendment which I offered along with Senator Inhofe. As all of my colleagues know, the amendment would strip the funding from the supplemental that was requested to begin the process of closing Guantanamo. Let me say at the outset that despite some of the rhetoric concerning this issue, this amendment is not a referendum closing Guantanamo. Instead, it should serve as a reality check, since at this time, the administration has not yet forwarded a coherent plan for closing this prison. Madam President, in the committee markup, I included language which would have delayed the obligation of funding for Guantanamo until the administration forwarded such a plan. I also included provisions which would not have allowed prisoners to be relocated to the United States or released if they still pose a threat to our nation. But after listening to the debate and reading media reports, it became clear that this message was not getting through. Rather than cooling the passions of those who are justifiably concerned with the ultimate disposition of the prisoners, the funding which remained in the bill became a lightning rod, far outshadowing its impact and dwarfing the more important elements of this critically needed bill. Instead of letting this bill get bogged down over this matter, as chairman of the committee, I determined that the best course was to eliminate the funds in question. The fact that the administration has not offered a workable plan at this point made that decision rather easy. But, Madam President, let me be very clear. We need to close the Guantanamo prison. Yes, Madam President, it is a fine facility, state of the art. And I too have visited the prison site. Yes, the detainees are being cared for with good food, with good service, with good medical care. Our servicemen and women are doing great work. But the fact of the matter is Guantanamo is a symbol of the wrongdoings which have occurred, and we must eliminate that connection. Madam President, Guantanamo serves as a sign to many in the Arab and Muslim world of the insensitivities that some under our command demonstrated at Abu Ghraib prison. It is a constant reminder that what we call enhanced interrogation techniques is referred to nearly universally elsewhere in the world as torture. Yes, we should not kid ourselves. The fact that Guantanamo remains open today serves as a powerful recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. Madam President, we Americans have short memories, but that is not so in other cultures. For example, when the Japanese Prime Minister visited Yasukuni Shrine, which commemorates Japanese soldiers from World War II, the Chinese were outraged. This controversy was for events that are now more than 65 years old. In Korea, the name of dictator Toyotomi Hideyoshi is still remembered today for the thousands of years and noses which were cut off Koreans and sent to him to prove to him how many Koreans his soldiers had killed. That atrocity is still remembered today by millions of Koreans, even though it occurred more than 400 years ago. For us, the dehumanizing photographs of detainees at Abu Ghraib are no longer fresh in our minds. But that is not true in the Middle East, where the populace remembers the degradation with
The senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent, we consent 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
When they think of Guantanamo, they remember those photos. Those images are still crystal clear to them. The wrongdoing has not been forgotten. Madam President, the closure of Guantanamo is a requirement for this country to help overcome some of the ill will which is still felt by Muslims around the world. To many, Guantanamo is considered an affront to the Muslim religion. Stories of improper respect for the Quran by prison officials, even though inaccurate, serve as a reminder to millions of Muslims that this prison must be closed. It is up to the administration. Madam President, many of our colleagues are justifiably concerned about how the terrorists at Guantanamo will be handled. They deserve answers, but so too we must begin planning to close this prison. That work needs to begin soon for the good of our nation and the men and women still serving in harm's way. It is up to the administration to fashion a plan which can win the support of the American people and its congressional representatives. As we approach the fiscal year 2010 budget, this will be a key element of our continued review of this matter. Madam President, I support the amendment for the reasons that I've stated above and urge its adoption. I yield the floor.
The Senate vote to cut President Obama's request for funds to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay was 90-6.
There's still time to get your copy of C-SPAN's 2009 Congressional Directory, with information on House and Senate members, the Cabinet, Supreme Court justices, and the nation's governors, plus district maps and how to contact committees and caucuses. It's $16.95. Online at cspan.org/products or call 1-877-ON-C-SPAN.
In a few moments, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner testifies on Capitol Hill about the state of U.S. banks. And the Senate's in session at 9 Eastern for more debate on a bill that includes additional war spending.
On Washington Journal this morning, a discussion of the president's plan for the Guantanamo Bay detention facility with Devin Chafee from the group Human Rights First and Cully Stimson, the former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs. Democratic Representative